Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's session. This is called Family Business in Agriculture and the Agritourism Sector. My name is Dr. Francesco Barbera. I am the founder and academic director of the Family Business Institute at Toronto Metropolitan University. Uh, the Family Business Institute is a new institute that aims to provide world-class education, research, and engagement in the family business space. And as a part of that initiative, I'm very pleased to welcome you today on behalf of the FBI team and in partnership with the Diversity Institute at Toronto Metropolitan University. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm joining you from Toronto today, which is situated on the traditional territories of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, and the Chippewa people. This land is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people, and is covered by the Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. So, as we gather to discuss the challenges and opportunities facing family-owned businesses in agriculture and agritourism sectors, it's essential to reflect on the deep histories that Indigenous stewardship, cultivation, and connection to the land, and to recognize our shared responsibilities as we look to these sectors. This session is a part of a broader series that is exploring the role of family business in Canada's evolving economic landscape. And as many of you know, family-owned enterprises are not only the backbone of rural economies, but also central to innovation, resilience, and community development in broader Ontario and Canada as a whole. In agriculture and agritourism, in particular, family businesses are navigating rapid change, whether it's due to climate pressures or shifting consumer preferences or generational succession issues. So today we're going to explore these dynamics more in depth, and we're going to hear from leaders who are imaging what sustainability, equity, and growth can look like in these spaces. We'll also reflect on the distinct strengths that family-owned firms bring to the table, from long-term thinking and intergenerational knowledge to deep local roots, a cultural continuity, and a connection to the land. So thank you for being a part of this important conversation and your continued commitment to supporting inclusive economic development in Canada's rural and agricultural sectors. Uh, to kick things off today, I'm pleased to introduce my colleague and our partner in this event, Dr. Wendy Kukier, who is sharing a brief presentation based on her research to help shape the discussion. Wendy Sukier is a professor of entrepreneurship and innovation at the Ted Rogers School of Management. She is the academic director of the Women Entrepreneurship Knowledge Hub, WEKH, and academic research director of the Future Skills Center. She is also the founder and academic director of the Diversity Institute at Toronto Metropolitan University, our partner in delivering this series, and brings deep expertise in skills development and training, as well as the role of inclusive entrepreneurship in Canada's economy. So, Wendy, over to you.
Thanks so much, Frank, and it's really a pleasure to be here. And I really appreciate the work my team put into to getting us all here today. And thanks very much to the panelists. I'm going to try to be brief, which is always a bit of a challenge, but I just wanted to start by saying, you might ask, well, you're a professor of entrepreneurship and innovation, you lead the Diversity Institute, the Future Skills Center. What's that got to do with farming and family business? And there are two answers. One is my mother grew up on a farm, and it wasn't a happy story because they actually lost the farm, and my grandfather became essentially a migrant worker using his skills to help other people manage their farms. But I grew up in St. Catharines, which is the heart of farmland. In fact, I have a house there now, and down the street, I can go and visit the goats if I want to. So I have a sense of farming as part of our heritage. And in fact, one of the things that concerned me when we started talking about entrepreneurship, both through the Women Entrepreneurship Knowledge Hub, but also through the Future Skills Center, was the focus on entrepreneurship tends to be on tech, right? If you do a Google search on entrepreneur, you'll typically find men from Silicon Valley, and that's what we hear about. They're really a very small percentage of entrepreneurs in Canada, and a lot of farmers may not think of themselves as entrepreneurs, but it's actually hunters and farmers who are the original entrepreneurs, because the notion of eating what you kill or growing or eating what you grow is really foundational to what we think about with entrepreneurship. And I did a book a number of years ago called Innovation Nation that looked at the history of a number of prominent Canadian tech entrepreneurs. What was really interesting was the strongest predictor of being an entrepreneur, even in the tech space, was being the child of an entrepreneur. And there are many prominent tech entrepreneurs who actually are the children of farmers. And they explain it by saying, when you grow up on a farm, you have to work really hard. Sometimes the gods are on your side and everything works out, and sometimes not so much. You have to be resilient, et cetera, et cetera. So for me, it's really, really interesting to look at farming through the lens of entrepreneurship and also farming through the lens of skills, because we also know, and I'll talk more about this from some of the research, that there is a bit of a crisis as partly because of the encroachments of development on farmland, and we've seen that in Niagara par excellence, but also because often the kids of farmers don't want to be farmers. I'm the exception, except my notion of farming is, Eva Gabor in Green Acres, where you have all the animals and the greenery, but you don't actually have to do any of the work. So, with that, I'll start. I'll start the presentation. And again, the lens that we are bringing to this is really, obviously, looking at family business, but also thinking about what the implications are for innovation, for growth, for weathering the current trade wars, building a sustainable and strong economy, and making sure that agriculture has the skills that it needs. And there's a whole nother discussion we could have about what's going on with tech. So the only thing I wanted to say about the Diversity Institute is we're big. We have 80 full-time staff. We're across the country. So we work in Saskatchewan, Alberta, Manitoba, where farming is much more integrated into the discussions of entrepreneurship. And our focus on equity, diversity, and inclusion is very much driven by notions of how it connects to business performance. So while we're obviously committed to human rights and social justice, we're really preoccupied with how we can harness the power of a diverse workforce that includes women, that includes immigrants, that includes racialized people, Indigenous peoples, and so on, to ensure that organizations are as successful as they can be. And one line of work we've been engaged in is, for example, looking at what's happening in some communities where immigrants are coming in and purchasing the farms, and what does that do, and what are the implications of that. So one of the things that I think is really critical to recognize is how important agriculture is, not just to our economy, but the society we live in. And through COVID and now through the trade wars, I think we've become much more acutely aware of how important it is to have a strong and sustainable agriculture sector. We also know that while a lot of agribusinesses remain small, medium enterprises with fewer than 500 employees, farm size is also increasing, and there are large corporations that are taking over some operations as well. So we see from work that the Canadian Agriculture Human Resources Council has done, that many companies operating in the area cite staffing and labor shortages as a critical issue. And I know that with the changes, for example, to the temporary foreign worker quotas, certainly in my community, a lot of farms are really reeling with the impact that that's had on their labor. The other thing that is a real issue we see in Canadian farms is succession planning. And part of it is because families, um, very often, and I know lots of examples of people who grew up in a farm, their parents, accumulated enough wealth to send them off to university to become doctors or lawyers or engineers or computer scientists, and getting them back to the farm was not in the cards basically. And yet a lot of farming businesses who don't have children who want to succeed their parents haven't really thought through what the opportunities are, the options. It's also important to note, and this is something that we've worked with, for example, women in agriculture, that there tends to be a bias um, towards male heirs rather than female heirs in many farms. Although this is being eroded somewhat as we see farms diversify and get into a wider range of activities beyond production of food products. So, where we see farms moving into agritourism and other kinds of diversification, we see more women. The other thing, as I said, is skills shortages are very significant and problematic. Like my first jobs were working on farms. You rode your bike down the street, picked strawberries. I was never good at it because I ate more than I uh, actually provided to the employer. So I didn't last too long, but I was probably 12 or 13 at the time. I graduated to cutting grapes. I wasn't good at that either, not because I was eating them, but because I was too slow. But we don't see the same engagement of youth in farming. And particularly when you think about it, 30% of people in Canada born outside the country, and many did not grow up in environments where farming was part of the culture. Many did not grow up. I mean, even though the family lost the farm, gardening was always a massive part of our family culture. But for many people who grew up in high-rise apartments in urban areas, the experience of even growing a tomato is fairly alien, and that's compounded when we start to look, for example, at the north. I lead a green igloo. I'm chair of the board. We build greenhouses in the far north, and finding local workers who understand that you can't go on a hunting trip for 2 weeks and expect the plants to survive is really a huge cultural challenge because growing plants is not part of community culture. So there's lots of complexity around hiring and retaining talent at all levels. And this is not just laborers. This is also, and that was something the temporary foreign worker was very important for. But this is also about tech because as farms become more technology intensive, um, uh, they need computer scientists and engineers and data analysts and so on. And yet many people don't have the notion that they're going to university and then going to work on a farm. The other thing I'll mention is, farming, again, when we think about tech, everybody thinks about apps and AI and so on. And one of the first AI applications that I was told about was when I was on a committee in the UK, and they were using AI facial recognition for sheep, because happy sheep produce more. And when we look at things like sensor technologies, when we look at automation, farms are often overlooked as a site for innovation. I was on an OECD committee on rural innovation, and it was very clear that our definitions of innovation often don't take into account agriculture. And there are also stereotypes. I mean, the notion that farming is a family enterprise. And if you didn't grow up on a farm, you wouldn't think about working on a farm, is something that we really have to address. The other thing is, as we've been doing a lot of work looking at technology adoption, what some of the barriers are, what some of the enablers are, and certainly there remain lots of challenges that are not just financial, but also cultural and have to do with skills. We also see diversification in the sector, and I know this is a bit controversial. You know, people I know who are real farmers don't necessarily like the fact that farms are being turned into tourist sites. However, there's no question that agritourism and diversification also provides opportunities for more um, revenue and more diverse revenue. And it's interesting because I've seen even in Niagara, like an explosion of the um, vineyards, for example, that also have bakeries or four-star restaurants or whatever, and it becomes a real draw to the community. So we have to think about a number of things, and as Canada is talking about big projects and a resilient economy, building a resilient economy, I'm really hoping we don't forget about agriculture and we don't forget about agritourism and we don't forget about the opportunities and the supports that are needed in our rural communities. And as I said, you know, I'm from the Diversity Institute, so I do think it's important to support women in agriculture, women in agribusiness. And we see in provinces like Manitoba, for instance, women are not a high percentage of majority owners of business, but they're a very high percentage of joint owners of businesses because family farms are often jointly owned by couples. When you talk to women in agriculture, though, they do talk about some of the barriers that they face, and that's something that we need to address. So, from our perspective, really digging in on family agribusinesses and really understanding the mechanics and the mechanisms and what works for whom and what the barriers are is absolutely critical to developing a national strategy that recognizes the importance of the sector. And I would argue that skills, you know, technology is important, financing is important, and so on. But I would argue that skills remains very important. We have to figure out a way to get a new generation of young people thinking about farming as an attractive career. And I think, you know, equity, diversity, inclusion, and truth and reconciliation are also ways to bring more than the usual suspects to the table. So thank you very much, and really looking forward to the discussion.
Okay, thank you so much, Wendy. I'm excited now to turn to our panel discussion, which brings together a group of exceptional leaders working at the intersection of research, workforce development, and inclusive growth in Canada's agriculture and tourism sectors. So let me introduce our panelists. I'll begin with Phyllis MacCallum. Phyllis is the Senior Program Manager of Research and Knowledge Mobilization at the Canadian Agricultural Human Resource Council. She brings practical experience to labor market information research. She was raised on a commercial cow and calf operation in Eastern Ontario. Phyllis has a passion for agriculture and business. She pursued a diploma in equine from Kemptville College, and then she finished her degree at the University of Lethbridge in agricultural studies and economics. Phyllis and her partner, along with their twin girls, now raise purebred Herefords west of Ottawa. And next we have Evan Hazenberg. Evan is the Director of Research and Policy at Tourism HR Canada, where he focuses on labor market challenges and workforce development barriers facing the tourism sector. A current focus of his work is on critically examining the definition of tourism and getting a handle on the industries and workers who are not being counted. Before joining Tourism HR Canada in 2022, he was a lecturer at the University of Sussex in Brighton, England. Welcome, Evan. Next, we have Mark Limas. Mark is a second generation farmer who owns and operates Limas Farms with his brother Rob. Limas Farm is a cash crop and custom farm operator managing 10,000 acres of farmland for grain crop and forage from production all the way to harvest. Mark's parents started the operation in the early 80s, and the business succeeded to Mark and Rob in 2013, 8 years after graduating from Ridgetown College with a diploma in agriculture. He now works with a variety of farmers in the region to care for the land to support their operations, in addition to Limas's farm's own production of crop and forage. So, welcome, Mark. And finally, we have Paul Moyer. Paul is a ninth generation farmer from the Niagara region. His family has been farming the same land since 1799. He is the founder of Moriers Apples and co-founder of CleanWorks, where they have patented a novel technology to sanitize food and medical PPE without using water. CleanWorks was awarded Canada's National Food Waste Challenge winner in 2024. Paul is a founding member of Farmers Markets Ontario. He's the president of the St. Lawrence Farmers Market and sits on numerous advisory boards across the province. Paul has a degree in microbiology from the State University of New York and a BSc from Auburn University in agricultural economics and marketing. He loves looking at how new scientific discoveries can help shape the agricultural sector and implement them in today's challenging environment. So welcome, Paul. And finally, Dr. Wendy Souquier, who I've already introduced, who will also take part in the discussion. So we're thrilled to have you all with us today, and we are going to dive in. But before I do, I want to just instruct the audience, if you have any questions that you'd like for me to ask the panel, please post them using the Q&A function that is a button down below in the Zoom meeting here. So welcome everyone. It's great to have you here. Such a range of expertise in the room, so I'm guessing we're going to get a very eclectic discussion around this. But keeping with the theme around family business, I guess I might start with something that Wendy kind of touched upon around the major challenge around succession. And so for the panel, if nobody speaks up first, I'll just ask somebody to go first. But if somebody has something to say first, please jump in. What do you guys think are the main challenges with succession planning and strategies, specifically for family firms in the agri-business sector? Does anyone want to go first with that one? Phyllis,
I'll
you and
go.
I had an interesting talk about this.
Go ahead.
All right. I there's a few challenges that come with succession planning. We see from the statistics that agriculture has a very low rate of providing succession planning for generational transfer. And I think a little bit is because it is family business. A lot of the conversation and challenges of agricultural businesses, especially when they are a family dynamic, are solved around the kitchen table. And there isn't a whole lot of desire to sometimes put pen to paper on decisions that could be futuristic. And so I feel that, we'll do that next week. We'll do that one day. We'll do that later. Often happens. And unfortunately, things happen in life and there is no preparation for that. And so that becomes very challenging for family members to then sort of decipher who's doing what, who's really responsible for things. It does get very challenging with siblings. I know many farm families who have difficulty deciding, especially if there's either equal involvement between siblings or limited involvement between siblings of who is going to get the farmhouse and who is going to get the land, and are we actually leaving the cattle to anybody? What do we do with all of this, all these capital assets that we own, if everyone's kind of involved or if no one's really involved? And so I often it's not to ruffle the feathers of the family, and but in doing so, it eventually catches up with itself. And unfortunately, being unprepared really prevents or really causes challenges along the way for the family to then resolve later on.
Yes. And that's indicative of the family business sector in general. I'm curious, and then again, this question is open to the entire panel. Is there anything specific about agriculture that makes this extraordinarily challenging, I wonder? Mark, you've experienced this yourself.
Yeah, I guess I'm on here. Yeah, I think in the huge amount of equity. In some cases, there's a large amount of equity to be moved. Um, in some cases, maybe that's a good thing or opportunity. In some cases, it's a challenge. Um, I think that's what would differ from, say, like a family restaurant or whatever, generational transfer. You can, it's conceivable that, say, one of the children or even just an employee could work there a few years, and then with some help they could maybe cash flow buying into the restaurant or whatever. But the farm business, you're talking like millions of dollars in equity that and debt. um, Sometimes it takes, so the return, like the profit margin in ag is generally quite small, and I feel like it just takes like 30 years of working for nothing to be able to get and experiencing the real estate, the increase in value of real estate and quotas that has led to this huge amount of equity. So say my parents they started with nothing. They they could they could work to cash flow a farm. So me and my peers or whatever, that's not really achievable. You need outside investors. In our case, our investors are our parents, willing to, you know, hold bank for 10 years without a return until we get our feet under us. That's kind of how we did it. Um, that that's a big part of it. Um, there's many things, like I have just notes here, like um, the non-farming kids is uh, is a big challenge. How do you fairly distribute that the equity and workload? And I mean, I could go into explaining how we do it, but maybe that's for later on in this panel discussion. Um, yeah, just different family dynamics of some of the heirs might have spouses and kids, and some don't. Changes your work-life balance. Um, yeah, I don't know if I'm leading discussion astray or not, but
No, not at all. It's actually a very interesting. I like the mention of the non-farming kids, which I do want to get into a little bit later on. But it occurs to me, Paul, that your family has done this, I guess, 9 times. Is that correct? So how, rather than maybe focusing on the challenges, what are some of the success factors, do you think, that helped you last that long, get through 9 generations?
I think, there's sort of 3 points. I think it's important that the matriarch or the patriarch or the founder of the business or the farm letting go. Um,
Mm.
I see lots of 75-year-old farmers and the son is 55 years old and he's like, I don't know if I'm going to have the farm or not. Like I've been doing this 30 years and I don't know where I'm at. So, you know, the father has to trust the son, and so on. I think that's a very important part. There's a lot of unclear rules and expectations. So you need to have those difficult conversations. And you're like, Dad, you know what? I want to help you and I want to stay on the farm, but I really want to be a doctor. Or I really like to take care of the cattle, but I'd like to start my own abattoir. There's some of these things. And then how do we maybe both do the same things? And then what we've done in our family and on our farm is we just took some of the business from the farm, and I started a candy apple company from the apples we grew. And that actually ended up being much bigger than the farm. You can do some of those things, value add and so on, but you don't want to have the guy that likes to sit on the tractor running the people in the apple factory, for example. So you need to have those clear expectations of, okay, there's 3 brothers or 2 brothers or 6 brothers. Do we want to stay doing this? And if we stay doing this, who wants to do what? And sometimes those conversations are a little bit difficult, especially when you're like, you know what, we bought a farm. We have a farm here in Niagara, but we had an operation up in Owen Sound, and who's going to run that? And who wants to go there? And so I think all of those things are very important. You had mentioned, Wendy, statement. Happy sheep produce more, better sheep. We forget that happy farmers produce better farmers too. There's a bit of a rhetoric where, farming's hard and you don't want this and so on. Well, if that's what you grow up with, the kids and the family and people aren't going to want that. So, make it fun and enjoy your work. Make it as fun and as important to you as possible, because I think there's a lot of, if the father or the grandfather were like, oh, I never wanted to do this and so on, it's gonna go down the family tree and say, well, of course I don't want to do that either. So um anyway, those are some of my thoughts.
Yeah, excellent. I think, it's funny because I'm hearing a lot of talk around, the commitment of the next generation, making sure expectations are clear, that we plan for this, that the incumbent is willing to let go and allow the children to do what sort of suits them. So exploring in a way too, the expectations, as you put it, Paul. Uh, but in agribusiness, I think there's some special connection to the land. There's also one farm, and the question is, how can that be expanded? You mentioned, through innovation and so on, which I do want to get in the panel later on. But Evan, I don't want to miss you because from an agri sort of tourism sector, perhaps that is a way of expanding what the farm is to allow space for future
Mm.
generations. And perhaps you have some insight onto the succession challenge in that space.
Well, I think succession is a challenge in most family-owned tourism businesses as well. So I think there's a lot of overlap between sort of the tourism sector and some of the labor challenges facing the agriculture sector as well. And then, of course, they meet in the agritourism sort of that intersection in the Venn diagram. But I do think one of the possible ways to get kids who are maybe not that interested in farming necessarily doing things like starting a candy apple business, or starting a bakery, or it's a way to say you can keep the business going even if you personally are not into looking after cows or grain or whatever it is. Like it's a chance um to expand sort of what your business does, and that can also make it more attractive to other members of the family. And it also is it's a viable way to bring a bit of extra cash into small farms as well when you're perhaps struggling with some of the realities of the agricultural market. Um, but it's an interesting balance in terms of skills, because the people that as Paul was saying, the people that you want handling customers are not necessarily the same people, and they don't necessarily have the same skills that you need to manage crops or livestock. So there's definitely a skills challenge there.
Interesting. Yes. Oh, it's such a fascinating conversation just because, as I said, this is related to family business in general, but I think there is a uniqueness in this sector in particular, and some constraints, but also some specific kind of advantages as well. Especially now as Canada moves into the agri sort of tourism space, right? There's a
Mhm.
lot of development that can be had. I mean, where a lot of other countries are pretty well established, whereas Canada seems to be up and coming, and so there's
Mhm.
opportunity there from an
Yeah.
entrepreneurial perspective, which kind of leads me into the next sort of. I'll shift gears a little bit to the next sort of phase of this discussion. So typically in family firms, we do have this clash between the incumbent generation and the next generation around how we always used to do things, so tradition, and what we ought to be doing now, like some innovation, right? And in theory, or you could sort of look at these things as opposite ends of a spectrum, tradition versus innovation. Um, I mean, that's debatable because there is sort of innovation through tradition. But that said, what are some of the sort of how can agricultural businesses sort of balance this concept of innovation and tradition through obvious, new ways of doing things through the adoption of new technology and so on, which is revolutionizing the agricultural sector? Again, this is open to the entire panel, but I will pick on people if I don't have any volunteers. What do you guys think about that? Paul, yes, you have your hand up,
I'll,
so
I
I'm
guess
on.
I'll start, I guess. So, we use a lot of technology. We've even developed some technology and so on out of it. But I think to start, don't use technology to solve a fake problem. Use technology to solve a real problem. So
Mm,
that's the first thing. And it doesn't have to be big, you know. Um, not just for the problem's sake, but that also will go and gain confidence of your brothers or of your family or of your father or whatever. You say, oh, you know what? He's really taking initiative here, and look at how that seemed to help and so on. So I think that's very important, not just um, to solve the problem. Obviously, it needs to solve the problem, but when it does, you gain confidence from your family, and you gain confidence in yourself to be like, that wasn't too hard. I'm glad that we ended up getting an electric ABC or whatever that happens to be. Um, and then I think you should, when you have that win, don't take that win as a personal win. Take it as a win for the family or for the company, and share those wins. Um, and then people will see that as being as an inclusive thing. So I think that's as important as using technology. Of course, you use cell phones for things and you use cameras for things. That's technology, and we understand that. But I think let's not get caught up in the technology. Let's get caught up in why we should use that technology and say, hey, look at this, let's try that. And as those little wins come, then they'll be like, Paul takes care of that, or my brother Tom takes care of that. And then, you won't get to a point where you have the 75-year-old farmer saying, you can't do this. I think that's got to start early.
mm. Interesting. Mark, do you have any maybe specific examples of new ways of doing things that you sort of had to push through your father and convince him?
Uh, yeah, well, first off, I will give my dad credit. He's done a bang up job of stepping back out of the way to sort of let us take the reins and go. Uh, so that's the well, that's the single biggest part of our success, really. Uh, I'm
Mhm.
getting off topic here, but back to what Paul said earlier, like that for farm succession, that older generation has to step out of the way, let the younger generation make changes, and then either and succeed or fail. Like sometimes you learn quicker from failure, I think, anyway. Um, this can't be massive $1 million failures. These, ideally just small boo-boos. But anyway, more to the line of the question. So we do use quite a bit of tech anywhere we can to save time is the biggest driver. Like it, saving time because that's our most limiting resource. I can't buy time. Um, and create efficiencies with labor efficiencies with around machinery is the biggest thing. Record keeping is the big one. Like an auto, there's a system on our machinery that's like telematics, so it's automatic record keeping of the work we've done, the products we've applied, geolocations, things like that. So all that tech is something my dad never dreamed about, and I mean, we have it here in our fingertips every day, and he doesn't care to look at it. Doesn't even know how to log on to it. So that tech, um, I made a note here, like that tech in itself is like a segue for the next generation taking over management. On our farm, it worked good because it was just the kind of the time frame when Dad was stepping back, we were stepping in, and like the old pen and paper. Well, Dad was more of just all mental. Everything was just tracked up here or forgotten about and just whatever. Um, so then we have two brothers coming in, and we have to communicate back and forth. The best way to do that is it has to be recorded or let a computer look after it. So that's where some of these tech, like these apps, different things, um, allowed. Yeah, there was no point in Dad learning that, and he saw that, and he didn't want to, which is great. So then me and my brother would we took on this new tech to manage the farm in a new way. Um, and yeah, I think it just actually presented a positive opportunity, really, rather than a challenge. But if if the timing of that hadn't maybe lined up, like I don't know, like 10 years from now, if I had to succeed this to my children, I'm not sure if that if that balancing tech with tradition, how I would answer that question. I don't know.
Hmm. Well, it's interesting because it sounds to me like, especially in this sector, like technology is almost a vehicle to help the next generation kind of develop their credibility as the future leader, right? So that's actually extremely interesting. I would imagine it is incremental, though. You would, but to everyone's point so far, the incumbent generation does need to kind of let you mentioned step out of the way, let go. They have to sort of allow this to happen. Phyllis, what do you think?
I think Mark made a really good point when he was talking about how, the paper pen situation to tech, but really all of Dad's thoughts were up in his head.
Yeah.
That's where things often are with well, the previous generation. And so, knowing um, sometimes where land is, what has been there, what has been applied, where, like, what cattle do what, all these things. It's often up in the head of someone and not even written down on a piece of paper. So when you start to do the transition from traditional to innovation, and especially if there has, like, both Paul and Mark have talked about the succession piece, but if there is that continuity in joint ownership between father and son, there has to be a conversation about that investment into innovation and how, both are going to function with that. And so sometimes it is large investment, which is dollars into the business, that makes a substantial change to how the business is run. And sometimes it's small pieces of innovation that just let things run a little bit easier. Um, we had a short conversation just about, kids on farm, and there are fewer and fewer kids on farm. And so, the need for automation, even if you are, father, son running an operation, and maybe it was just dad before primarily, there's still really not enough people to go around. And so sometimes bringing a few pieces of innovation that, run fairly simply. Not that the older generation can't learn good, tech, but that just makes everyone's life a little bit easier and allows for the farm to prosper and potentially grow from that because productivity is actually growing. So yeah, there's a lot of opportunity, and we see that in different ways depending on the sector that you're part of. I see, the smallest piece of innovation that saves time on a beef cattle operation. And then I've been in, 30-acre in-glass greenhouses where there's tech everywhere you turn. And so it just depends on what you need, what your needs are, and how you go about investing in that.
Interesting. As you speak, Phyllis, I'm realizing that that old knowledge that's all up in the head of the incumbent generation is quite valuable as well, right? So I wonder the extent to which that coordination needs to occur around, rather than just blindly kind of implementing new tech or sort of
Absolutely.
integrating it with that old traditional knowledge and sort of finding the happy medium or a more efficient medium, I should say. And Evan, I guess that's for you. Like in this sector, do you find that family businesses in particular are more or less reluctant to do this, or do they implement it more in a more kind of careful, methodical way? Or what are you seeing in the broader agri space?
I mean, on the tourism end, it's often a big change, um, in terms of the product and the interaction with the public and stuff. So, any significant change does introduce the same issues that you have with the technological improvements. As some people don't want to do it, some people don't like it, some people think there's a better way to do it. There's a traditional way was better. Um, and I mean that can, in a family business, that can also introduce tensions if, as we've sort of been talking about so far, the older generation is perhaps not super comfortable letting someone else make some of those business decisions. Um, and it can also, I mean, I think, as Phyllis was saying, there are fewer children on farms now, and there's a real move for sort of urbanization of generations. So
Mm.
even in rural communities, if to the extent that people are still having big families anyway, um, there's just, even outside the immediate family that owns the farm, there may be, like, the labor pool may be shrinking. Um, so there's just fewer kids around you could hire, or they're leaving town and they're not coming back. And as that's a problem in terms of the agriculture, but that is also a problem if you want to expand the business and say, we have this great opportunity to be a bakery or to do candied apples or whatever it is that we want to do. Now we have two labor problems we have to solve. We need people on the agriculture side, but we also need people on the tourism side as well. So it's, I think, shrinking families and that urbanization are two pressures that are definitely facing agritourism, I think.
Yeah, and of course, I mean, I'll just add it. You please feel free to elaborate, but the skills required or the skills shortages back in the day are totally different to what the skills are required now. And I guess with respect to training or developing the next generation, it's a totally different model right now in terms of what we're
Mhm.
training them for.
Yeah, I mean, on the agritourism, or on the tourism end of agritourism, I think we like the tourism sector has an opportunity to position itself as meaningful jobs. It's not just you're sitting in an office punching a clock. You're not sitting in front of a computer for 12 hours a day hating your life. You can be outside, you can be using your hands, you can be interacting with the public. And I think there is a real thirst from a consumer perspective for authentic experiences. And a small farm, that's a fantastic way to connect back to where your food comes from and to feel a connection to place. So
Mm.
I think the demand is certainly growing, which also poses problems from a workforce supply area. So I mean, accessing training around customer service, around product development, I think that's going to be important. But hopefully, that kind of thing, as I said, can draw people back to the farm. And as tourism takes off in more sort of smaller and remote communities, hopefully we see less of a drain of young people. They think, oh, actually, I can stay here and I can have an interesting job and I can have a good life and I can do something meaningful. It's good for my community, it's good for my country, it's good for my economy, it's good for me, it's good for my family. But I think there's going to be some conversation in the labor market about what are people actually looking for in jobs and where they can find that. And I think tourism and agriculture both have to do a better job of claiming our bit of that pie.
Interesting, very interesting. Like as you speak, it occurs to me that, the whole business on an operational side of farming is totally transforming, right? Which is a
Mm-hmm.
good segue for sort of the next question that
Can
I
I
have.
just maybe
Sorry.
add
Sorry, Wendy,
something,
go ahead.
Frank?
Yes, go
Yeah.
ahead, please.
I think the other thing that we know is obviously farms are in rural communities. Often rural communities don't have the kind of infrastructure, whether we're talking about public transportation, childcare, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's not particular to agriculture, but it's acute with respect to agriculture because of the issues in rural remote communities in general. So that has a big impact on access to labor as well. And the only other thing I wanted to add about the technology adoption piece is again, if you look at how there are a lot of government programs that, and we're hearing a ton now, right, about AI adoption and our national strategy to advance AI adoption, et cetera, et cetera. But if you look at who's around the table, tends to be the usual suspects, tend to be other sectors. And, from my point of view, it's really important to make sure that agriculture and agribusiness are not left out of some of these big discussions because there's a lot of money that's going into small medium enterprises and AI transformation. But I haven't seen any people in agriculture at any of the tables I've been at. So those are just two quick points.
Yeah, and meanwhile, they're such an important sector, right? So it's interesting how it's hard to understand how that's been overlooked. Actually, I have a related question from an audience member that I'll ask now, coming from Rene Remy, uh, specifically around the gaps in talent, like we've sort of been discussing. So the question is, in agritourism, what are the gaps specifically, I guess, in talent, and what support services do they need? And I'm not sure who wants to take this one on, but
Well, I mean, I can get started certainly. A lot of the stuff around um, sort of working with the public. So there's a lot of customer service skills, which is one of those things that is never classed as a skill in government taxonomies of occupations and skills. But you know, people who spend time in tourism, they find their customer service skills that they develop there one of the things they take away with them and that support them through the rest of their career. So it's sort of one of those things that's invisible. You don't know you need it until you need it. But also thinking in terms of product development and product marketing, if you're trying to invent a market for something that your community has never really marketed before, you may be inventing tourism in your region. And so you also need sort of that product development lens and the marketing lens on that. Like there's a lot around sort of it's a different kind of business than agriculture. They fit together really well in many ways, but it's also a different kind of beast.
I think
yeah, so
also
yes, Phyllis.
um is the promotion aspect as well. So you may be um quite far from the market you're trying to attract. I know of operations that are, if you're familiar with the GTA area up on Highway 9, and they are attracting folks from downtown Toronto. It's like a good 45-minute drive. And so, how do you get your information out there that you are a market, that you have product, that you are offering these services to someone well beyond, your network. And so I think that's a big piece. And I think that's a lot where when you're starting out, where things start to sort of flutter away because you have your product, you've developed it, you've branded, you've printed the labels and you have it all ready to go. And, we're going to build it and the people are going to come. And it may just be your neighbors, which is fantastic. But your neighbors can only eat so much of your stuff. And they might be trying to sell stuff too because they probably farm out in a rural area. And so how do you get, essentially city folks or, more urban out to your operation? And so I think there's a lot of that piece as well. And there's a lot of work that can be done. And we're seeing more opportunity with, web design and folks that are in that space to help with some of that promotion. But it's a big piece that has to, especially if you're going to, maybe not build your whole revenue on it, but there are some farms that are very much relying on value add product and agritourism and the farm production piece to sustain the farm because farming is challenging. And so you have and like you have a few shots at it, but you really only have like a couple shots at it to make it, and kind of stick with the plan. And so I think there's an opportunity there to really hone in on the promotion piece and ensure that, you have a clear message about what you're offering to your customers.
Mhm.
Yes. Paul, did you want to add something to this?
Yeah, so we're a traditional farm for, and over the years the farm changes. When the
Mm.
family first got here, it was traditional farming. They had 6 pigs and 2 cows and some grain and an old barn and so on. And then in the turn of the century, the late 1890s, early 1910 or whatever, we got into the fruit farming business. My father transitioned into a U-pick operation, and as the years progressed, we did more and more U-pick. And my brother and I got into a little bit of not a fight at all, but as the business got bigger, we needed more parking. So now we have parking for 1,000 cars, but we needed parking for 1,000 cars. So we took some of the land out of production, and we took the worst land out of production because it was the hardest, most clay land and so on. And now that's parking. But that actually caused a problem because on the best land we grow peaches and cherries, and on the worst land you grow plums and pears and apples. And so we actually took apples out of production for parking. So now it caused a problem for the caramel apple business because we're like, we grow apples and and now we can't grow apples anymore. Are we being unkind to ourselves that we are now buying our neighbors' apples to make our caramel apples? And you know, and now I think we've got 45 toilets on the farm because when you're busy, during cherry season, my brother spends as much time fixing toilets as he does spraying trees. So you get into, as your business grows, you're like, I need to be more of a plumber and less of a something else. So, very interesting things happen, and we certainly see that. And then eventually we said, let's not make the candy apples in the barn anymore, because if the barn burns down, that would be a tremendous tragedy. So we moved it somewhere else. And then we ended up doing enough places where we can't do it on the farm anymore because there's too many employees for toilets and water. And so you have to go and get a spot in an industrial area. And all of these times you make these decisions, you start thinking, am I getting away from what my roots are and what I find important? And all those things. And now, am I in agriculture, or is a giant factory in the city part of agriculture? I'm good friends with the Chudley family, and they're in apples, and then you pick apples, but everybody knows them for their pie blossoms and selling apple pie to the Olive Garden in Texas, right? So these things. Are you going away from the family farm? Are you staying in the family farm? And all of those things start to become gray. And I think it's important that once you realize some of those things can happen, I stood next to the owners of a Woolwich dairy. and they had a little tiny dairy with some sheep, and I think they just sold to Loblaws or something, and they got big. And are they a family dairy? We see that all the time with Chapman's ice cream. Are they a family? But are they corporations? So you start
Yeah.
blending these things, right? So it's interesting what can happen, but be ready for it.
Yes, very
That's
interesting, right? And it speaks to the, sorry, did I interrupt somebody?
no, no, no.
I was
Go
just
ahead.
saying it speaks to the nature of the industry itself, how it's diversifying, how it's evolving, and what sort of the roles that family businesses in particular play throughout this in terms of introducing that new innovation, but also bringing in the new skills that are required. Like we said, sounds to me like, obviously there's a technology piece there, Paul, and what you did, for example, with the CleanWorks business is an example of that, but also clearly business related skills around, promotion and strategy and this sort of thing, right? Which kind of is a good segue for me to get into the next line of questioning. Sorry, Wendy, I see your face.
Sorry. Um, I just wanted to mention that increasingly, there are discussions around how we move beyond production of raw materials and more into processing. And the food, we talked about agritourism. We've sort of touched on food processing, but it's interesting because what we see are food processors backward integrating. So Heinz, for example, purchasing farms, which may or may not be a good thing. But then we also see some classic stories of forward integration, like McCain, which is arguably one of the most successful agriculture-based stories in the country. They started after 3 generations of farming to move into food processing. So I think that's something we haven't talked so much about. It's also a very interesting opportunity, especially when you think about the impact of technology, but also some of the national investments the government claims it's going to make.
Well, that's
Sorry,
interesting
Frank.
because, that speaks to the integration piece speaks to maybe a consolidation happening in the sector in terms of, farms getting bigger and bigger. But then with the agricultural or the agritourism side of things, I do believe there's sort of space for the small players. What does the panel think about that? I mean, how does this interesting industry sort of shaping up to be? Is it just a bunch of large players with some little independents doing tourism stuff, or what's happening with the landscape in terms of the evolution of things? Is there room
Um,
for the traditional way of doing it still without integrating one way or the other?
I get to travel a lot. So I'm in California and so on. I get to see a lot. And there's giant farms out there. I actually had a meeting with a guy last week, and he said he ships when he's busy for 5 months of the year 180 tractor trailer loads of peaches a day.
Wow.
Okay. And he's a family farm, but like tremendously huge. But what I actually see is starting to happen is bigger is not necessarily better or more successful. So, what is success? Like, we have to recognize what is success. Oh, look, Paul's successful because he sells candy apples into Texas or whatever. But is a bigger farmer more successful? You get to that story of the fisherman by the sea. He goes out every day and fishes. He takes his basket full of fish to the marketplace, comes home, makes his family dinner, and goes fishes in his cottage every day. And then somebody says, "Oh, you could get somebody to help you." And then the next thing you know, he gets a bigger boat, and then he gets 2 boats, and then he gets a facility to process that. And then he's like, "Yeah, this is great. Now what do I do?" And he said, "Well, now you're worth millions of dollars. What are you going to do?" And he's like, "I'm going to buy a little cottage by the sea and go fishing every day." So, we've got to be careful um, to say what is success. And weirdly, the government and stuff is pushing bigger and better and exports and and that's not necessarily what we need to be doing. And I can tell you, when you have to feed the beast, it gets difficult. I've got 300 employees that I've got to feed every day. And where am I getting, your stress gets high. And you're like, I remember liking going out and had 3 people and they helped me pick the peaches and I take them to market and it was nice. Like, I think that that's changing. I think bigger is certainly happening because you have to feed Loblaw, you have to feed Sobeys, you have to feed Metro, you have to feed Costco, and they won't deal with the little people. They just can't. They can't deal with 700 farmers for peaches. That one guy that says 150 tractor trailers does them all. That's easy because there's only one buyer. But I think that the happiness factor and what's important to you is starting to change. I don't know if you ever watched that video. It's a little, or it's on Netflix, the biggest little farm or the littlest big farm. And I know these people and they're really great people. It's not necessarily realistic, but the fact that you can enjoy your life and so on, I think that's going to change. You don't need a giant farmhouse and you don't need, you know, you can live with less if people are willing to buy it at a little bit of a higher price. And I think that that's going to come about. It's common in California to go to a farmer's market and see 12 $15 eggs US. That's pushing 16 $17 Canadian for a dozen eggs, and people are happy to buy it because it's not their biggest expense, and then they can have it. But we're not quite there yet, but I think that's the future.
And I think agritourism can also help sustain some of the smaller enterprises that want to stay small, that don't want to become those big monsters that, you know, employ hundreds of people and, sell all, supply all the Costco peaches, who want to be that smaller, um, hang on to some of those maybe more traditional farming methods, or, keep the size and keep the family feel to it. So I think agritourism is one of the ways that some of those businesses can continue to sustain themselves in the face of that consolidate, get bigger, bigger is better sort of mentality.
Yeah. And I presume that it changes the method of production too, right? So, for example, factory farming versus free range and all the rest, with respect to what customers are demanding nowadays.
Just wanted to add that the food processing thing doesn't have to be large, right? So if you look at some of the apple producers in Niagara, they've gone into cider production as well, for instance. So it isn't that you necessarily, because you're forward integrating, doesn't necessarily mean that you're operating at scale. It's just often the margins are greater, as you all know, in the production of the food that is processed versus the raw materials. So I think that was the it's a financial consideration from my perspective. Where can you make money?
Mhm.
There's a really good quote, and it's escaping me right now who has said it, but it's the farmer sells everything at wholesale and buys everything at retail, and he pays the freight both ways. And it's such a interesting piece when you start to talk about the supply chain, because if you start to integrate that and start to keep that essentially in-house, providing further value add, you eliminate the middleman essentially, and you have more control over the dollar value that is coming into the operation. And so it really provides an opportunity for the smaller operation to gain some of, the money that they essentially, in the long run, in theory, are losing by, sending it into commercial markets. And so we see that. And I mean, obviously we have beef cattle. These are my cows behind me. We have a small herd. I am from a family farm, but we have started our own. I'm not on family land. And so, I very much am in the same boat with those who are starting for the first time. I have the experience, and that has honestly led me to being able to do this with my partner. I I mean, I take my hat off to those who start and say, I'm going to learn how to farm, because I don't know how I would do it without already 25 years of experience, following my dad's shadow and then, starting on our own because we're still learning. We still run into problems and I go like I need the vet, because they have the knowledge. And so it really is a piece that you have to start to think about when you are smaller about how to put the most bang into your pocket. And so there is opportunity there, but again, and I think it was a comment that was made earlier in the session was, um, there's only so much you can do, and that's where we start to see the challenge is that, I have an off-farm job. My partner has another business that he runs, and we have the farm. And then if I'm going to do, you know, agritourism essentially by, trying to do value add, like I am, we are two people and we have, we've started a family and all these things. And so, then it's how do I manage all these pieces? And really that's why I think we see the intensity to grow and just try to capture market space because it not necessarily is the easiest route, but it's sort of the most direct and and one that you're sort of following the crowd. And so it presents its own challenges along the way, but there's still so much opportunity, I think, and it's one piece personally that I would love to get into when we have, 5 minutes of free time on our hands, is because I do see the value in people purchasing on farm and, having like a farm stand and being able to offer, sort of that experience. I enjoy educating folks who aren't on a farm about farming and what that means and why we do it and all these things. And but it's literally hours in the day at this point in our lives. And so hopefully one at some point we will be able to because I really like it. But yeah, it's finding that balance and current and in the current market, where is the best opportunity for us to get as much money out of the farm as possible before we transition into other avenues of revenue generation.
Right. Well, it's yeah, look, so there's a lot of evolution happening as we speak, Paul mentions that the big wins in the industry. Mark is now working alongside his brother, which is very different from, a father with two young boys. That's a very different kind of operation. Phyllis, you're talking about, hey, I wish I had an extra 5 minutes. So what I'm wondering, and I'm going to close it off with this is the final sort of line of questioning, it's just what sort of support systems and resources would be most beneficial for agricultural family business development. What is out there now, and what is lacking, and what can Canada do better?
Well, one thing on the tourism end, I mean, and I suspect it's probably also true on the agriculture end, but I won't put words in Phyllis's mouth. Is that it's becoming easier to get high quality training without having to leave the farm. If you have internet access, you have access to a lot more training, and it's higher quality training. At the dawn of the internet, I mean, there's still quite a lot of maybe slightly disreputable people who are going to train you, but there is high quality training out there. And I think looking for ways to put the right training opportunities in front of the right people is a big way to do that, to sort of meet some of those needs without, because, if people say, oh, I'm going to move from small town to big town to go to school, there's a good chance you might not come back because you might discover, oh, the big city is really exciting. And but
Hmm.
eventually you need people to come back to those communities. So I think accessing um, sort of skills-based training, and there's tourism skills-based training. I'm sure that there's agriculture skills-based training and business skills-based training for marketing or whatever it is that you need. And I think that has a transformative potential if people are aware of it and if people see the value in doing it.
Yeah. With respect to seeing the value, I wonder, like, is there an educational campaign out there perhaps that could be introduced around just promoting the benefits of this, right? I wonder, you guys are living this. I wonder, what is when you're growing up on a farm, is it that, oh, I've always wanted to be a farmer kind of idea, or is this something that obviously, to Paul's point before, needs to suit your personality, etc.? So how do we bridge that gap, the commitment gap of the next generation?
Yeah,
Again, this
I
is
think
to,
it's part of
yes,
the, I
thank
think it's
you.
part of the conversation on Evan's point about training. I definitely agree with that. And I mean, both Evan's organization and the one that I am part of at CARC, we try to set up programs where we see there's like sort of a gap in skills, and we're doing more and more of that work, and we're doing skills research so we can identify what we're missing, so we can get programs put in place, whether that's delivered through our organizations or through others, your government, programming generally. And so we're trying to identify where the gaps are as we move, into technology, into innovation, into these new avenues for, and Evan's group, like, specializes in agritourism, but even agriculture's job needs to sort of look at agritourism, because we need the farm to have the agritourism. So, how do we ensure that we're communicating with folks in agriculture that agritourism is an option? And these are the programs that are available to ensure that you have a successful business in doing that. And so, it's really about our sector organizations working together and working on those pieces. I had a conversation with some ladies in ag just last week, and we talked about the amount of money that is sitting in funding pools for different programs. And um, now it's sort of like a two-sided coin on this. We do value the dollars that are allocated for different projects, but we often hear of them, one, very late. They require like 75,000 pages of paperwork, which nobody has any time to fill out. And it often is like a reimbursement sort of deal. So you are upfront cost with the kickback then. And unfortunately, the farm just doesn't have the cash flow to do that. So nobody uses those dollars generally, sort of generally speaking. And so what the women were talking about was there are programs in, I believe it was Denmark, they were saying, where they actually give, I think it's like $50,000 to start your business. Because if you have an off-farm job, you are running your new farm as a side hustle, essentially, and you will side hustle that for years trying to make it work. Whereas this literally cash flow injection allows you to start and prioritize building the farm. Now I know $50,000 is not like not necessarily a salary for some, but it starts the farm and gets you the basis. And I think that's something that Canada needs to consider if we plan on having folks who are so far removed from the sector join us. Whether you are Canadian and you want to join because you've been off farm for generations, as many are, or if you're new to Canada and want to get into agriculture here, potentially because you've had exposure from your country of origin. And we need an avenue for letting that happen, because we like otherwise we won't grow this sector. And it I know it requires, like, oh, we'll just give cash out. No, but it has to have some sort of basis like that, so it's actually accessible and achievable. Because working off the side of your desk kind of deal on trying to build a capital intensive operation is a long road. Just a long road generally. So,
Well,
Right.
and if I can jump in on that, clearly there are programs that are targeting agriculture. But there are lots of programs. This comes back to one of the first points I made. There are a lot of programs that are targeting small businesses, which is defined as under 500 employees. And my sense is a lot of operators in the agriculture sector are not aware of those programs and their availability. I mean, even things like we talked about skill shortages and how do you get kids involved. Well, there are tons of programs that offer subsidized placements for university students or recent graduates or newcomers. But my sense is, you know, it's focused on traditional tech, as opposed to thinking about agriculture in that in that pool. And even if you look at the sector councils that have been given, basically the stewardship of that money, there it's the usual suspects. It's manufacturing, it's ICT, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that was one of the points that I was trying to make, is that I think, of course, there's, Farm Credit Canada and Ag Canada have specialized programs, but I think there's a real opportunity to expand the thinking about what an entrepreneur is, what a small business is, and make sure that people in agriculture are getting their share of the pie, because my sense is they're not. And as you said, Phyllis, the reimbursement model, that actually doesn't work for almost anybody.
Anybody?
We
No.
hear the same thing from, startups or retailers
Yeah.
or whatever, is being forced to spend the money and then get reimbursed, and having to hire someone to spend 3 weeks writing your application for, $5,000. Like, why bother? So
Yeah.
I do think there's some advocacy in this space that could be beneficial. And I think now there is a moment in time where we're talking about national projects. We're talking about Canada's sovereignty and security, and food security has got to be a big piece of that.
And I
Yeah, and
think
just
that
as a quick follow-up on Wendy's, when it comes to agricultural grants and applications as opposed to small business, we were part of a conversation last week as well that in agriculture, you age out at 35 generally with any funding grant opportunity, whereas small business and like future entrepreneurship programs is 40. And so we're starting to have this conversation that if 35 is actually the age, and like I commented at that call, I have now officially aged out. I mean, I have 10 cows. I've spent my life in agriculture. I've done what I could to start building my farm. I have now aged out. And so, what could 5 years give me? Probably lots of opportunity. But, so there's these pieces that are creating barriers to folks entering the sector, and they need to be addressed so we have more opportunity.
Yeah. So, to use the farming pun, it's siloed at the moment. We need to integrate better. I think I have a couple questions that are related from the audience, and I know we're gonna be wrapping up in a couple of minutes, but people are wanting sort of practical guidance. Someone, Chow Mai is asking about, do we have any networks or associations that we could recommend that would help connect farmers with agricultural organizations? We also have something in the chat from Ann Woolger asking about specific suggestions around the granting agencies, because she's saying we don't know where to look. So is there any practical kind of like tips that we can give our audience before we adjourn?
Well, on the associations, every province has a provincial ag association. So I'm assuming most of our attendees today are Ontario. So the Ontario Federation of Agriculture is your provincial association. Depending on well, all the commodities. Depending on what commodity you're joining, you will have a commodity association as well that would be provincial, and you may even have a regional group if you are developing your commodity in that region specifically. So like if you are in Niagara doing fruits and veg, you would have commodity associations down there for sure. And yeah, those, and if you are looking outside of Ontario, every province has provincial ag associations. And on grants, I mean, I'm happy to show some lists of where things are. There are kind of lists available. If I think Wendy has all our contact information and she can get us connected on the agricultural side. And if I don't know if Evan has resources for agritourism.
Well, I was going to say there are tourism associations in every province as well, and often also sort of by sector. So if you're thinking, oh, I'd like to have a little, Airbnb or something on my property, you can get in touch with your provincial tourism association or an accommodations association. Again, those are all provincial, and we disseminate a fair amount of our resources through that provincial network. So, if you're thinking about getting into agritourism, if it's something you're thinking about adding to your business, start by reaching out and seeing what's already out there, because there are quite a lot of resources. It's what we were saying, they're there, but you just don't know about them because
Yes.
the structures are not thinking about the farm down the road. They're thinking about the guy who's got a new idea for a widget for your phone.
Got it.
And
And
it's
And I will offer on behalf of the Future Skills Center, if, we'll try to coordinate what people have got. And as follow up to the session, we'll send, the deck, the video, etc., and some resources. And just to mention for folks who want to go into the Airbnb kind of tourism space, there's also auxiliary dwelling unit funds that are available in many municipalities where you can get $40,000 if you're creating space you're going to rent out, as long as you've owned the property for, I think, 3 years. So there's a lot of this stuff that, I would say the agriculture associations work here, but increasingly we're seeing farmers engage in other spaces, and perhaps they don't have the support they need to navigate. So we're happy to take that on.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, there's an
I
entire,
think it's,
sorry, Paul.
I was just going to say, I think it's important to be brave and just go and ask a farmer. Like, you don't have to go through an association. If somebody came up and said, look, I'm from somewhere, and what's the best cherries to grow? I'm like, well, don't grow the Gisela 9s, grow the Gisela 29s. If I wanted to say, hey, Mark, I got to plow 1,000 acres, he's like, well, I recommend a 9-furrow plow, because once you get into 10-furrow plow, you're going to need to get a tractor that's, just ask, get a Massey Ferguson 135 for $5,000 with a PTO, and you're on your way. Very simple little things. Mark's smiling because you're like, yeah, that's what you need to know. Don't step over a PTO. Don't pee on the electric fence. Don't stand behind the cow. Like, there's some very simple things that you need to know that my dad taught me when I was 7, but you're not going to learn it necessarily from association. Now, association's going to say, oh, I'll put you in touch with this person, but you can just go and ask. I'd love somebody to come up to me and say, what's the best hard apple to put in? Because I make some candy apples. I'd be happy to tell you.
Yeah.
It's not Hershey asking me; it's somebody just like me, and just go and do that and be brave. And honestly, we're all here. I would love to talk to somebody about it. I'm like, oh, good for you. You're asking the right questions. So that's
Yeah,
my
That's
advice.
great advice, Paul. Great
I
advice.
have to
Mark,
echo Paul. If
sorry.
somebody has animal, livestock starting questions, I'm happy to give my contact information. I'll help where I
Yeah.
can.
Okay, and I think as a part of, so I'm mindful of the time. As a part of the sort of the offering here, we will this is being recorded. This webinar is being recorded, and we'll also offer contact details and a resource list as well. I just wanted to get the panel talking about it because I think maybe there might have been some additional aspects that a list that the university could provide might not have. So thank you to all our panelists for sharing your insights. This has been a very rich and thoughtful conversation about the unique role that family businesses play in shaping Canada's future, especially in the agricultural sector. It's amazing how time flies when you're having fun. That we are out of time. I do have to wrap up. But we've heard about the complexities in this space, around labor shortages, succession challenges, broader sectoral shifts, and how this is all evolving. But we've also heard about specifically the strengths that you guys bring from deep local roots to intergenerational knowledge to a kind of a long-term commitment, right, to the community and sustainability. So as we continue this series with the Diversity Institute, we're very focused on elevating the voices and experiences of family-owned firms and on identifying, actionable strategies that support their resilience, their growth, especially in the rural sector. So on behalf of the Family Business Institute and our partners with the Diversity Institute, thank you so much again for being part of today's session. If you're interested in continuing the conversation or learning more about our upcoming events and research, we encourage you to stay in touch. Take care, everyone, and we look forward to seeing you again. Thank you.